Hey everyone, it's Johnny Catrue, and today I'm listening to Atavistic Black Disorder Commando, the brand new EP from infamous Norwegian black metal group Mayhem. You know, some bands gain notoriety for their effect on their culture or for the innovations they make in their musical genre. And while I'd say Mayhem did both of those things, they're probably more infamous for their tragic backstory of suicide and murder. But on this channel, we're far more interested in what really makes the band notable, their music. Because in fact, this band did affect their culture through their uncompromising sound and image. And they did innovate in metal music through their unique combination of styles, and they probably influenced all black metal that came after them. Many assume that since the very first Norwegian black metal albums to be released were A Blaze in the Northern Sky by Darkthrone and the first 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 that these guys were the originators of the style. But in fact, both of these acts, whether 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 rehearsals and shows that was put on by Mayhem in the late 80s. Their live album, recorded in 1990 called Live in Leipzig, didn't get an official release until 1993. But all the early second wave bands had copies of that live recording on cassette. And Euronymous' approach to riff construction and the harsh, brittle sound of the guitars and the recording itself very obviously had a huge influence on all of those early second wave bands. And about that harsh sound, something that's not always well understood is the origin of that approach. The first wave black metal bands such as Bathory and Celtic Frost were often quite close in style to the harsh thrash metal of the day. And even some early thrash bands like Slayer and of course Venom used a rough and unpolished sound that emphasized the dark, unfriendly vibe of their music. And if you were to ask where these trailblazers got the inspiration for this sound from, you might be surprised to find that many of them would tell you they got it from demos and early recordings of hardcore punk bands. I think there's often an inclination to see the evolution of metal as a singular continuum, but the fact is that many of the early metal artists in the 70s and early 80s honestly didn't have a lot to go on. So many early 80s metal artists were equally inspired by the early metal of the time, punk rock, and even prog rock. Because the fact is there just wasn't a lot of metal out there before the new wave of British heavy metal came along. So the early pioneers of extreme metal tended to look for the darkness they wanted in music in any genre they could find it, really. And punk rock and hardcore punk in particular happened to be delivering it in spades, especially through its raw sound. All that being said, I am certainly no expert on hardcore punk or punk rock in general. I'm really more of a fan of prog rock and other classic rock genres, and also early metal. Most of my understanding of this evolution comes from listening to interviews and podcasts of my favorite metal musicians talking about their inspirations, especially the ever garrulous and knowledgeable Fenris from Darkthrone. So when I heard that Mayhem is putting out a new EP, half of which consists of early punk covers, firstly I was not surprised, but secondly I wasn't really sure how interested I personally am in the concept. But after thinking about it for a while, I decided that this actually might be an interesting way to get me more into the early hardcore punk pioneers that have influenced so much of the music I love. If I enjoy any of the covers on this EP in particular, maybe I go and check out the album that they originate from. And besides that, the first 3 tracks on the EP are Mayhem originals, and I did really enjoy their last album, Demon. So with all that in mind, let's give this new Mayhem EP a listen. The first song was already released as a single, and I did enjoy it quite a bit. So let's get into it. Track 1, Voces ab Alta. Alright, so yeah, I think that's a pretty great song, you know. It's a good example of the sound of modern Mayhem. And they continue to have this very mechanical sound, I guess especially coming from the drums, which I quite like, although maybe I do prefer a more natural sound in my black metal, generally speaking. I do really like the changes in tempo across this song. You know, Hellhammer is still, to this day, one of the best drummers in black metal, I think, always has been. And his playing on here is great, although I would just say maybe if it just sounded a bit more natural, I could appreciate it a bit more. Attila Csihar is still on vocals. He rejoined the band a few years ago. I thought he was brilliant on Daemon. It's great to hear him again here. I know his vocals on their famous debut album, the Mysteriis Dom Sathanas, are quite controversial, but I personally love them. And in this song, we got his trademark snarls alongside a bit of his operatic melodic singing coming up in the background. I always love to hear that. It's one of the things I really love about the debut album. All those different vocal styles that Attila puts on top of the songs. You know, he's really an innovator in black metal vocals, and I think he should get more appreciation for that. So yeah, overall a cool song. Maybe I wish the riffs were a bit more memorable. That might just come in time though. But on my first couple listens, what comes across more to me is the changes in rhythms and the vocals. Track 2 is called Black Glass Communion. Hey, so that was a pretty exciting track. Very high energy. Great to hear that from the band at this point. The main riff at the start that returned at the end, it reminded me of Death Crush stuff. I wonder if that's what they were going for with the 5/8 time signature and everything, calling back to that Death Crush material. It kind of makes the idea to go back to their roots with the punk covers make some more sense if this is the new material they're coming out with as well. They seem to be going back to their roots, their very early roots before they even had any success or anything. I did kind of come to realize on this track though that I do kind of have a problem with the mix on this so far. I think the guitars are just a bit too quiet. You know, the drums are extremely loud. I don't know if it's just that they've been turned up or the guitars are just too quiet, but it seems to me like the guitars are not having the impact they should entirely. At least the vocals are clear and they sound fucking fantastic. But you know, at least in this one, the guitar riffs did come across to me and I can even remember the main riff in my head right now. So it's not too bad. But I just think the music would be having more emotional impact if the guitars were a bit more up in the mix. Track 3 and the last original song on this EP is called Everlasting Dying Flame. All right, I really enjoyed that one. That was great. Right from the start, the bass lines really jumped out at me. That was a nice surprise. It reminded me of the dark melodic bass lines you hear here and there on the Mysteriis Dom Sathanas. Obviously, the bass on that album was performed by you-know-who, 𝐜𝐻𝐽𝐻𝐿. But I don't know how many of them were actually written by Necrobutcher in advance of the recording. Obviously, he'd been playing those songs with the band long before the album was recorded. Anyway, I love the style and it works great here. I actually loved the guitar riffs all over this one. Again, they call back to the golden age of the band's sound. It might not be the most original approach, but it sounds great. And if anyone's gonna play this way, why shouldn't it be fucking Mayhem? Oh, and another outstanding vocal performance by Attila. Fantastic. So that brings us on to the covers. And the first one is by, I think, a British punk band called Discharge. I see them listed as a D-beat band, and that's something I've heard of from Fenriz, who talks about D-beat influencing some of the rhythms we hear in black metal, especially the Motorhead inspired one, the boom-ch, 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 boom-ch. Honestly, I always love it when that rhythm shows up in black metal, so I have been meaning to hear some D-beat, and in fact Discharge has come across my radar, especially their debut album. It's supposed to be great. This song seems to be off one of their EPs. It's called In Defense of Our Future, and it's track 4 on this EP from Mayhem. Here we go. Okay, so I'll say right off the bat, I did like the main riff from that one. The da-na-na-na sounds pretty cool. Although some of the changes sound a bit too generic for me, which I guess is a problem I do have with a lot of punk rock. But we actually had guest vocals on this cover by Messiah, who was one of the earliest vocalists for the original band, making a bit of a cameo appearance here and sounded pretty great. Actually, his vocals were probably the highlight of the track for me. I think that the problems with the mix that I had with the EP so far have carried over to this, which isn't surprising, but I do think it's actually maybe more of a problem here because honestly, the drums are not doing anything special, and yet they're so fucking loud in the mix. They really don't need to be that loud. I just think if the guitars were matching the volume of the vocals, the sound would be more effective, you know? But yeah, the song was pretty cool. It wasn't what I would expect from D-Beat. It didn't have the rhythm I was expecting. It struck me as more of a typical punk rock song. But yeah, not bad. The next song is a cover of a song by the band Dead Kennedys, a really influential hardcore punk band, and I have actually heard their first album, and to be honest, I wasn't a huge fan of it. The sound of that album was a big turn-off for me. It really had a really weak sound to my ears. You know, it's something I might need to come around to. I know it's a really respected recording. But yeah, this song is off, I think, their second album, so I haven't heard it before. And we actually have Maniac doing guest vocals on this one, another very early vocalist for Mayhem. So pretty cool how they're bringing back the old guys to come and feature on these covers. So let's get into it. It's track 5. It's called Hellnation.
And there ain't no more Hellnation.
So on the whole, I think I enjoyed that one a bit more. I quite enjoyed all the changes. There wasn't anything generic to me from that, although the vocal breakdown was maybe a little corny, but you know, if that's how the original song goes. I did get the impression that Maniac was doing an impression a little bit of the Dead Kennedys vocalist, which I guess is fine. It sounds like they were having a lot of fun making this, to be honest. I did feel that the guitars were a bit more impactful in that song, thankfully, and there was some pretty tricksy, impressive drumming going on by Hellhammer in there as well, which I did enjoy. The next song is another cover, of course, by a band called Rudimentary Peni, who seem to be an anarcho-punk band. I know nothing about it. I know nothing about them. I have no idea what to expect, but the song's only a minute long, so that's interesting. Let's get into it. It's called Only Death. All right, good to hear Attila back on this one. You know, I just think his style of vocals works so well with the band at this point. And, you know, I'm going to assume that the vocals on the original did not sound like that. Attila was very much doing them in his style, and I like that. I think that's the best way to do a cover. Obviously, this song was very simple, but you could actually hear on this one how something like that song might have influenced the stuff on Death Crush, you know, the early days of Mayhem. And that's really interesting. Not much to the song, really, but, you know, it sounded good. Now, the last song is a cover by a band that everyone knows, Ramones, one of the originators of punk rock. I know and quite enjoy the first Ramones album quite a bit. I remember when I first heard it, I didn't like it at all. You know, it kind of set the template for punk rock in the way that generally didn't naturally appeal to me. It's just extremely simplistic and not very aggressive, if anything kind of pleasant, I think. But it did grow on me, that first Ramones album, and now I do quite like it. This song that they covered is called Commando, and it's off their second album, and I'm sure I have heard that, but I don't remember it at all. But maybe this will give me inspiration to go back and revisit it. So let's get into it. Track 7, Commando. Okay, so that's the last song, end of the EP. And you know, I was quite surprised by that one. Attila sounded really different. I mean, what that was Attila, right? Let me know in the comments. He really was giving it a full-on hardcore punk vocal. And the interesting thing is that obviously Ramones are not a hardcore punk band, but that sounded like a hardcore punk delivery to me. I mean, with my limited knowledge. That's what it sounded like. I mean, there was some melodic part in the chorus, I think, but other than that, it was very amelodic, very much just a growled vocal. And you know, it sounded pretty good. I did like it. I'll be interested to hear the original of that one in particular and see how it compares to this version. So yeah, not a bad way to go out. But I have to say, on the whole, the EP feels a bit weird, you know, pretty lopsided and maybe not entirely thought through, which I guess is fine, you know. Probably they did this with a spirit of fun and just doing what the fuck they felt like. But yeah, I did feel that the first few songs, the first 3 songs, definitely sounded like what I would expect Mayhem to be doing at the moment. It was not too far from what they were doing on Daemon. And then the last 4 songs, the punk covers, just sounded, well, although the production was the same, the style was more or less completely different. Although the only thing I will say was, like I said earlier, you know, there was a little bit of a feeling of going back to roots in the first 3 songs. So I suppose with the punk covers, they just took that even further. But on the positive side, I will say that I did enjoy pretty much everything on this EP to some extent, and I'll look forward to going back to it. I do like the direction Mayhem seems to be going in with the new songs, so I'll be excited to hear their next full-length album that hopefully won't be too far away. But yeah, overall, I just think if the mix could be a bit better, you know, not have the drums so prominent, get a bit more of the feeling across from the writing, from the riffs, that would be great. But yeah, overall, this EP was good fun, and I enjoyed it. So do me a favor and click the like button on this video. If you enjoyed my review, you can support me using the link in the description to buy me a coffee. That'll really help me to keep the channel going. And thank you very much for watching. Until next time, take it easy.